Any Pearls fans out there? Just to kind of pull from what you've been discussing and reading about in the last session, what was one of the major components of the good neighbor policy in terms of we, the United States, are going to be better neighbors, and for starters, we are not going to what? Intervene. And what I love about this is guard duck. I mean, if there ever was a comic where I just read it, I think this was written expressly for me. Because the whole strip Pearls is wonderful. You got to check it out if you haven't seen it. But the way that guard duck here just very casually talks about invading Venezuela, I think is pretty telling in terms of just what Americans see as a penchant for intervening in, you know, what many people paternalistically still today call our backyard. Okay. So I just kind of like that as food for thought. Is the United States being that good of a neighbor in the 1950s? Okay, I think that the support of Batista and others like him would suggest, at least from the Latin American perspective, the answer is, well, no. Okay, the United States is not being all that much of a good neighbor, depending on whom you talk to in the 1950s. So just to kind of sum up where we are throughout the 1950s. Again, you know, we need to get to why this abrupt change in policy, why the Alliance for Progress. Okay, in the era of Batista, okay, U.S. policy toward Latin America, broadly speaking, is look. Yeah, there's a lot of areas in the world that are underdeveloped, but for Latin America, at least, we're going to ask you to rely on private capital development to build up your economies. Okay, so in other words, if you want to modernize your societies, don't come to Uncle Sam and look for large grants, aka the Marshall Plan. They said the Marshall Plan's a totally different situation than what we have in Latin America. Don't ask us. If you want a car industry, for example, if you want roads and infrastructure, then invite Henry Ford in to help you out with that. Okay, if you want to build up your oil industry, as the Brazilians, Argentines, and other countries were asking, don't ask Uncle Sam for direct government-to-government loans. Ask Standard Oil. Ask John D. Rockefeller. Now, of course, what this did is it kind of ran into a century's worth of distrust and historical memory on the part of Latin Americans that had the same suspicions of large American corporations as, say, the American progressives did back at the turn of the century. So our perception domestically of robber barons was shared and perhaps held even more suspiciously in Latin America. So that was kind of a tough sell. Again, generally speaking, the U.S. preference in the post-World War II period, and I think arguably before, since perhaps the start of the century and beyond, is the U.S. is going to support governments that are friendly to U.S. business interests. And certainly by the start of the Cold War, oppose communism. If we would like them to be democratic, there's no question about it. This is not as if Uncle Sam is consciously seeking governments that are undemocratic. I mean, surely not. But I think so if they're democratic, that's nice. That's great. That's icing on the cake, though. The main criteria, I think, have to be, from Washington, D.C.'s perspective, that these governments be friendly to U.S. business interests and anti-communist. Okay, so what this leads to is really, well, you know, the ideal leader that you might like to see running countries X, Y, and Z is hard to find. Okay, and so this led to American support for quite a number of unsavory characters. You have, when I came in, Brian was talking about the Somozas in Nicaragua. Okay, one of the Somozas, I think it was Anastasia, once bragged that Nicaragua, as we think of Nicaragua, is my farm. Which part of Nicaragua? All of it. Nicaragua is my farm, not this county or this plot of land. I mean, he just said, well, the whole country is essentially mine. You have Marcos Pérez Jiménez in Venezuela, and certainly, of course, Fulgencio Batista in Cuba as one of several dictators that the United States recognizes as dictators privately. But they, from their point of view, well, we don't have that ideal Thomas Jefferson ready to take power in one of these countries, so we're going to work with what we have.
Yeah. Is there somebody in particular in the Eisenhower administration that is like the architect of his Latin American policy? Is there a particular individual that kind of stands out, that kind of spearheads all of this for him?
Not at first, I would say, because according to Eisenhower, it wasn't the first area of the world that was on his brain. Right. It was kind of, that's on the back burner. And so the people that dictate the big picture global concerns are the ones that have his ear. So, and the people doing that would be, say, Secretary of State Dulles, who's not particularly interested in Latin America. To some extent, Treasury Secretary Humphrey, because he's the one watching the pocketbook, so to speak. And he's the main guy saying that he doesn't want to spend American money everywhere in the world. And so since we're not doing that right now in Latin America, all these little guys that come up saying you need to spend more in Latin America, let's not listen to them. So the people that are pushing for more loans to Latin America and a much more sophisticated approach where we're not just supporting dictators would probably include, well, I'll give you one name, the president's brother, Milton Eisenhower, was a longtime advocate of more attention as well as more economic aid to Latin America. Okay. So he doesn't really have a specific government post until later in the administration, but he's Ike's brother, so he can call him on the phone and say, well, this is what you have to do. And there's a lot of interesting correspondence in those letters where sometimes Ike is receptive and other times he's saying, well, in reference to the Marshall Plan, he said, the reason we're not giving money to Latin America is because there aren't any direct communist armies in Latin America like you might have with the Red Army facing Western Europe in the 50s. And of course, that other emerging problem in American foreign policy for Eisenhower is the emergence of communist forces in Southeast Asia with, say, Ho Chi Minh and others. However, in so again, I think that's a good point to bring up in terms of, well, this is from the point of view of official Washington. It's a back burner issue. Like Saludos Amigos that was mentioned earlier, that film. That's kind of great because at the end of the film, there's a great friendship established between Donald Duck and Jose Carioca. And Carioca gets some, I think he doesn't eat peppers and drinks all sorts of stuff and everything. But even in the movie, there's kind of this idea of the quiet, placid, lazy Latins on siesta. They're kind of mellow. They don't ever rise up. Culturally, there's just that kind of bias and stereotype there. It's tranquil Latin America. It's the land of the quiet siesta. Nothing ever happens there. So you don't have to worry about it.